Campbell Art College in the third year. And I think what I thought I'd do maybe is, instead of talking and telling you what my work's about, maybe if you fancy just having a look at the work and perhaps like asking me some questions and telling you what you think about it. And then maybe I'll just come in at the end and try and like embellish, give you what I was hoping was going to be about, what I hope to not do.
My first thought is that it's slightly confusing because it's a book, so I expect to be able to read it. And some of the words I can read, but some I can't read very clearly. So my next question about it is, so am I meant to be able to read the words or not? Or am I just meant to be looking at the shapes and the flow of the sentence, if they are sentences, of the marks, let's say? That's my first. I'm not necessarily asking for an answer yet, but that was just to start us off.
Yeah, maybe I'll give an answer and just lead on to that. So it's a series of, it is a series of diptychs, like landscapes. It's meant to be like a piece of rhetoric, like a sort of a negative landscape followed by a positive landscape. So in reference to your question, the negative landscapes, which are layered writing, which are quite difficult to read, that is meant to be more reliant on the indexical mark as an expressive mark. So, I mean, I hope in some ways that it has quite a lot of chaotic energy to it, and that is in effect what those landscapes sort of convey. So you should be able to pick up, it may not be the easiest read, you should be able to pick up some of the language in those landscapes, get some idea of what's going on. But yeah, so it's definitely meant to be a difference there.
Does it have a title?
Well, I started off with a title, but I wanted to make it a little bit more generic. So it was based, I did a couple of months' work in marketing in central London as a waiter, effectively, cleaning toilets and various other things. So the postcode for that was WC1R, and a lot of my word art is landscape-based. So I was going to just reference I have referenced my works before just through postcodes. But I wanted to get away from the specifics of an actual specific location, specific landscape. I just wanted to build on this idea of, for me, my art is performative, so it's I bring a positive mentality to the environments I'm engaging in. And so for me, I felt the cover represented that as sort of black and white, and it's sort of replicated throughout the book, throughout the diptychs with a black and white background. So I was hoping in terms of the form of the book as an object that it might represent in some ways the key idea behind it in its object. So no, it doesn't have a title.
Two things that I've noticed. I thought this one could be related to dyslexia. And there's quite a strong contrast, and I'm colourblind myself, so it really helps me to see it. So I just wonder if there's anything.
Well, for me, no direct link to dyslexia, but I think I wanted the landscapes to be open to interpretation. So they're not meant to be prescriptive. So it's great if someone picks up the work and reads something different into it. Then just an answer to your second question, is it about contrast, was it? Within the two pieces?
Yeah, because I'm colourblind.
Okay, so does any of it not work?
No, because I'm colourblind, it's, the black and white is actually really fantastic. The contrast in it is really good. For example, if it was white with red writing, that would be extremely difficult to read because I'm colourblind, but most of it's very accessible.
Okay, cool. Well, I had, because I'm not colourblind, so I wasn't making it from that perspective. But there was an element of colour for me. I mean, I'd say predominantly black and red I've used. And I was quite interested in the idea that red as a colour can be both like optimistic or aggressive, depending on which concept you mix it with. So as a signifier, it can make the word smiling sort of seem bright, but as a signifier, it can make the word fuck you seem quite aggressive. So that was my point behind the use of colour. But yeah, again, great if it's working on a contrasted level.
I like the idea of letters being seen sort of as themselves, if you know what I mean, rather than just as their meaning, individual meaning. So the shape.
You like the shape, right?
Yeah, I like personally, because I use text,
Yeah.
I like the idea of text being a shape, but I'm not quite sure what's to lead me to think of this. You use the word landscape
Yeah.
a lot,
Yeah.
so I'm not quite sure how you're leading me to see this as landscape, rather than going, what does it say, what does it say?
Okay, so where's the visual emphasis? Or,
Yes.
okay, well maybe you could talk about it a little bit more generally. So for me, like the words on a page, if you talk about free verse, they're like they sit in a field, and for me, like where that field is, whether it's projected onto a wall or a canvas, I'm not really making a distinction. Visually, in terms of why should you look at it visually?
Landscape, it was the word landscape that you used.
Right, okay, I mean, I suppose like to be more specific, I would say wordscape.
Okay.
Yeah, but I think funny enough, if you take a phrase, I was trying to think, but I mean, I suppose if you were to just write this phrase out from the first wordscape, landscape, that arsehole, if I just say that arsehole just sitting there telling me put your back into it, I thought fuck you, you cunt. If you write that out on a typewriter in just 2 straight lines, it's actually quite boring. It looks a bit, it has no energy. So what I've taken is this idea from projected verse. This is where someone's projected verse. Projected verse is about the spoken word coming out of the mouth and having loads of energy, and it comes from the gut, it comes from the emotion. And what I've sort of tried to do is take the energy that I've just spoken about in projected verse and bring it back into the indexical mark. The indexical mark conveys the energy of my body and my mind and my emotions in the same way that if you were to like shout, if you were to perform this as an oral piece, you might get that same sort of representation of body. So just to go back to the landscape, the visual representation of these words, I hope, like are quite chaotic, quite aggressive, a lot of energy in the mark making, and for me that turns it into it gives it a strong visual presence, which I think is an element of what it means to paint a landscape.
It was the melody of the bag.
Can I just
then
find
Sarah,
the
sorry.
lexical marking?
Yeah, okay, yeah. Actually, it's a good question. So someone's asked me before, and I'm just trying to explain it. Basically, this is my sort of definition, really, but I mean, like, the index, is that the index finger? I was getting confused. It's the finger. So, it's linked to the body. So it's a trace that is directly linked to the body. So I think quite a good.
Sorry, can I just get you to a trace linked to the body?
Yeah, it's just anything connected to the body. So because the index finger is obviously part of the body to make.
So if you make a mark with your finger, it's indexical. If you've got a pencil in your finger,
It's also indexical. Let me just explain a bit further from my.
any mark not be indexical.
Most marks are just. Let me give a sort of. Let me give a strong example.
We need to.
If you're in the desert and you're dying, and you've got a scrambled piece of paper and no pen, you might cut your finger. You might try and write something in your blood. And for me, let's say you die and someone finds this piece of paper, they may not actually be able to read what it is you've written, but the indexical mark the trace of the blood, might be the most powerful sort of element of that symbol, that form of language. So it's about the mark, from the body and the trace and how it's expressed, rather than a conventional symbol like a word, like hello.
That helps, the lady behind the quiz.
Hi. So is the whole book a final piece?
Final.
Final.
Final piece. This is my live project, so I'm going to have to write a 6,000 word essay on it in the next couple of months. And then, potentially, this piece, I do a lot of work on silk screen printing, so potentially this piece will be scaled to like large diptych, like landscapes. Yeah, so it's an object in its own right. Yeah, it's resolved, I hope. But there might be a second stage. Actually, and there's a second point to that. I think there's an artist called Ed Rouchet who did a book called 25 Gasoline Stations, and then he went on to scale that back to canvas in the gallery. And I think my idea with the book was it can be quite frustrating as a painter. You might make a painting, no one wants to exhibit it, no one buys it, and then you go and stick it in your rack and store it for a few years. And it's just a nice way, this sort of cheaper, more portable format, so you get my ideas out into the world in a fairly sort of cheap-ish manner, in multiple forms. I think it's called penetrating public consciousness, so I want to get my ideas out into the public. I felt the book format would be good.
Do you mean you are selling this book?
Sorry?
Do you mean you are selling this to the public?
I didn't understand. Sorry.
Are you selling it?
Oh yeah, well that was my thing, was like, if I'd be delighted if anyone wants to take a copy with them tonight, it's just for free.
I want to know why a book, why not on a canvas, why not a print, a poster, why does it have to be in a book?
Yeah, no, good question. Basically, well, my understanding, like, for the book as a form, as a art object, one of its key requirements is that it's sequential, because you like turning pages. So there's an element of narrative to that. So, I mean, the setup for this book has changed a little bit, but fundamentally I see it as a series of like discourses or arguments. So there's a sort of like presentation of a negative environment, and then a more positive way of extracting value from that environment. So I'm sort of describing this as a discourse, as a piece of rhetoric, or a wordscape of rhetoric, sort of mini discourses. So that's why, really, if that answers the question, it's a sequential series of small discourses.
The lady has responses.
But then earlier you said that if it's using your blood, you can write with your blood. Yeah? That, for me, that's more meaningful, that's quite powerful. But this is just a print in the book.
Yeah.
It just doesn't have any meaning, it becomes quite flat. Not really.
Yeah, that's true, yeah. There is something about scale in painting and expressiveness. So this might well be scaled to large scale, I don't know, a couple. But I was working over the summer in my bedroom. I don't have any access to studio facilities. So this was a chance for me to work in digital mediums. I mean, it's still very expressive for me to make in terms of it's all hand drawn. But then I had an opportunity to work with Photoshop and InDesign. So this was this is an opportunity for me to work in a different way. And also, it's less impactful, but this probably, more people will probably see this book than they would see painting in my studio.
Jo?
Yes, I was going to say, I kind of agree with what you're saying, because I feel like maybe for some of the power you're talking about, there's a bit of a tension between, you pick up this glossy book, and it's kind of, you expect it to be, it's a bit like a brochure or something, because it's glossy and a nice size. So it's kind of nice like that, and I like the tension between, you think it's some kind of brochure, and then you're really kind of thrown by what's inside. So I kind of like that tension, but I think I agree with the lady there that some of that power we're talking about is kind of lost in the size and in this like very packaged thing.
Okay.
But the tension between it maybe some kind of commercial thing and then the kind of surprise is kind of really nice.
So you don't like the silk finish? So
Yeah, I think it's something to do. Well, it's not that I don't like it.
it gives
What I'm getting from it is something different to what's inside. So I like the kind of contrast with what you expect from the glossy paper to what you actually get. But yeah, I mean, it's only an observation. I don't know if it's,
I would agree.
maybe not kind of got the power is maybe slightly taken.
Yeah,
I don't know.
I agree.
Maggie has a response, and this lady wants to respond again.
I think it's interesting now because a number of contradictions or conflicts of language have emerged. Joe's just mentioned one. We've got the book versus a painting. You've got the black and the white. And the marks themselves feel very gestural, as if they were made on a much bigger scale. So for me, there's also a conflict of scale. And so those pages feel like fragments of a much bigger part. So maybe the whole business of contradicting languages is something to explore further.
His response is...
It's almost feels like if you made mass production, it's more almost feels like you made a mass production. It's much more easy for you to do it this way, to print many of the same thing. As an artist myself, painting, if I make one painting, I can't make the same copy again. It's impossible. That's really difficult. But what you've done, you've made it life easier for you, that you can print thousands of these copies. It's that value really lost the value because it's manufactured. You know that's what I'm trying to find out. Where the value is there.
Yeah, I think maybe it's like some points like I mean, I am interested in the primary art object, but I think the artist, Artie Bierkamp, talks about, she's happy to get her ideas across in whatever medium. So she'll make a painting, but she's absolutely delighted if you see the painting on the internet, and if you buy a print of it that is just like an A5 size like this. But it's better that her ideas get out into the wider world, not necessarily in a primary format. I think I started off definitely with my objective was to take my ideas out in a format that could be multiplied. So I've lost some of the impact that, or maybe even a lot of the impact that some pretty big silkscreen prints would have realised. But I was operating without studio access, and the goal was to take this object and sort of get it outside of the studio and indeed get it outside of the gallery. And I think there's another thing, it's like the idea of the object sort of bumping around in the world and just influencing people. So I'm really hopeful that that this object can operate like that. You can take this object home and you can show it to a friend. I mean, they may not like it, but there's an opportunity for it to be sort of to have an effect outside of the gallery. So I agree with you there.
We have time for one more, Caroline.
Well, unless somebody else, because I've asked already.
We've got time for just one more. If anyone's got anything, or we can Caroline?
Oh, okay. Going back
Is it a short one?
It is a short one. Very a simple question. Do you want us to be able to read all those words? And can people here read all those words? Is it just me that can't read them?
Yeah.
So do you want us to read what the words are?
I made a deliberate decision when I made those wordscapes, the negative, chaotic wordscapes, that I would I would prioritise the indexable mark over the ability to read it. So and it was still I do liken it, this French poet Stéphane Mallarmé talks about the pen being like a dancer on the stage. And if you're trying to put a huge amount of energy into quite a small piece of paper, it's quite difficult not to come off the page. It's quite difficult. So I hope you can get the gist from those negative landscapes. They're not hugely intellectual. If you come away with some sentiment of aggression or negativity, that's probably what it needs to do.